My name is Sara Marcketti, and it is my great pleasure to serve as the past president of Costume Society of America. I am joined by my moderator and colleague, Elena Karpova. She is currently a Putnam and Hayes Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She and I had the wonderful pleasure of working on The Dangers of Fashion together, and we're so glad to have you with us. Oftentimes, when we think of the dangers of fashion, disasters such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh come to mind. These tragedies made public the dubious business practices of conducting business and creating clothing in dubious and downright dangerous conditions. Elena and I called on 22 leading experts in the apparel field with the hope that this book, as well as this panel, this 4-part panel series, would be helpful to educators as they're teaching the next generation of apparel leaders, as well as executives and just anyone with an interest in fashion and sustainability. I am really thrilled for tonight's panel. It focuses on sustainable sourcing, production, and consumption. And there's a thread of environmentalism that will run through the talks. I wanted to just share a quote with you from Dr. Sheng Lu and Dr. Ting Chi in their book chapter. They wrote, "Fashion companies must recognize that achieving a balance between economic growth, social well-being, and environmental sustainability is no longer an option, but an obligation to society." Reading this statement really buoyed me to think about the possibilities that exist for us as consumers, for educators, and for the global apparel industry. I turn it over to my colleague, Elena Karpova, to introduce our first panelist.
Everyone. So last week, at the opening session of the series, we discussed incredibly important design decisions to ensure ethical and sustainable fashion products. This week, we will consider how to make these design ideas a reality, from building a sustainable supply chain, producing fashion, to understanding how our everyday choices in clothing consumption can make a difference. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first two presenters, Drs. Sheng Lu and Ting Chi. Dr. Sheng Lu is an associate professor in the Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies at the University of Delaware. His business aspects of the textile and apparel industry, including international trade, trade policies, and governance of the global supply chain. Among his students, Sheng is often referred to the least fashionable professor because he teaches the two least fashionable courses in the department, which are sourcing and trade and retail math. And while those courses might not be glamorous for students, they're definitely a backbone for the industry. Dr. Ting Chi is a professor and chair in the Department of Apparel, Merchandising, Design, and Textiles at Washington State University. His research focuses on strategic supply chain management and marketing. And he received funding to support his research from Environmental Protection Agency, US Department of Agriculture, Walmart Foundation, and many other private companies. Even though Ting is in the fashion department, he might be the one talking the most to his students and colleagues about slow fashion, classic styles, quality, longevity, and sustainability. So with that, I am pleased to turn in to the authors of chapter 7 in the book, Sheng and Ting.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Karpova, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. And the chapter Dr. Chu and I worked on is about trade and sourcing. Oh, by the way, I also run a blog post. I mean, sorry, I run a blog on site called shenglufashion.com, which could be the least fashionable fashion blog in the world, by the way. I'm joking. Yeah, so the topic of Dr. Chu and my chapter is about trade and sourcing. So why trade and sourcing matters to the fashion industry? Very simple. Just take a look at your closet, and very likely, and you will find items labeled "Made in China," "Made in Bangladesh," "Made in Vietnam." So according to some statistics, by 2029, nearly 98% of clothing consumed in the U.S. are actually imported, and they come from over 150 different countries. Yeah, now here I'd like to give you a kind of big picture about the current patterns of trade and sourcing in the U.S. So in general, I think U.S. Fashion companies, they source from two major regions of the world. One is Asia, which currently account for like 80% of U.S. apparel imports. But also, U.S. Companies source a lot from nearby countries, and I think this is something that is growing in popularity. We call it near sourcing, or even sourcing locally from the U.S. One thing I really want to kind of mention is kind of this is a misunderstanding. Often people say sourcing is just about finding the place with the lowest wage level or just chasing the lowest cost, and this is far from the case. And in fact, these days, fashion companies have to consider a lot of factors like sourcing cost, sourcing cost, flexibility, compliance, or even flexibility. So actually, it's a very long list of criteria and a factor company have to put into consideration to choose where to source their products. And this is a study I conducted in collaboration with the U.S. Fashion Industry Association. So we have the chance to really talk to some of the largest U.S. fashion brands and retailers to understand their current sourcing practices. This is a study we conducted last June, and one finding I personally find really striking is, despite the financial pressure caused by COVID-19, and the majority of companies do say they committed to sustainability. Okay, it's not like because of the financial pressure they're just giving up sustainability, but in fact they still want to allocate more resources, kind of give training to their internal staff, to their suppliers, and they care about who is making their products. And in terms of sustainability, one thing is, companies these days, they care about who is making their products. One example is they really tracking their suppliers. Not only they know who is making the garment, like cut and sew the garment, but also, and you can see it's quite popular these days that companies also know who is making the fabrics. Okay, and that being said, in terms of who is making the yarn and fibers, and this is something still relatively hard to do that, but I think companies are trying to be more transparent about who is making their products. And also, I want to say, to make sourcing more sustainable, and definitely we need to do more. Or, putting this way, to make sourcing more sustainable is very challenging. It's very challenging. Here are some of the top challenges companies say they're facing right now. Some of them, and you can see some of these challenges is really about the nature of our industry. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be relatively easy to know who's making a garment, who's making a fabric, but still it's very challenging to know who is making a fiber. Okay, so this is one challenge. And also how to build the trust to make the vendors more willing to share their information. I think this is something we need to do more. Last but not least, still, the financial restraint, like how to allocate more resources to do audit, or maybe have a dedicated team out there to kind of contribute to sustainability. I think this is something we can continue to do. But no matter how, nobody can kind of say sustainability is not important anymore. So that's my presentation, and I'm kind of give the floor to Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Dr. Sheng Lu. So I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk about our chapter and also some general issues about fashion or textile and apparel in specific for sustainability or ethical behaviors. So in our chapter, we talk about the histories of global sourcing and what are the factors behind this moment. So if there's something happened, there must be some reasons behind the moment. And so why the globalization happened, why the global sourcing getting popularity in the past 20, 30 years. So because for companies, there is a technology available supporting the global sourcing process, and for government, the comparative advantage behind those global sourcing or globalization, so we can optimize resources, including capital resources, personnel resources, to maximize our advantage in the United States. We call capital intensive, technology intensive, those kind of industries or sectors. Why allowing developing countries with human capital, the human capital I refer to low cost and plenty of less expensive labor suppliers, and with the intention to help developing country to build or develop or grow their economies. So this kind of low entry barrier industries. So a lot of positive ideas, positive purposes at the beginning of this globalization or global sourcing of textiles and apparel in the past. And a lot of positive factors still exist. And this is the why global sourcing still enticing most retailers and brands as a major strategy for their the way to get their products. So we are not going to see major changes for global sourcing in the foreseeable future or near future. A lot of statistics Dr. Sheng Lu just showed us, it's just the changes or shifts among countries or among continents. It's still the overseas products entering US market, still the majority going to meet the demand of consumers. However, there are some changes happen in the past a decade or a little bit longer than past a decade. We're talking about whether we can do better in this big context of globalization. What are the issues? What are the problems we are facing? So in addition to make the business viable and meeting the consumer demand for clothing, so what we can do better to make this industry better or more sustainable. So we started to have more discussion on those issues, particularly in the past decade. And consumers are also becoming more aware of those issues, or we can do better, or companies or retailers or educators can do better. So insourcing becoming a more popular issue among retailers and brands, policy makers and consumers paying more attention to insourcing. So why we are not getting our products in the United States supporting local economy and creating more job positions? So technically it's possible. We have technology, we have very sophisticated workers, although we don't have plenty of supply of sophisticated workers like overseas major suppliers. But what we can do to educate and prepare labor forces to meet insourcing, insourcing we refer to made in USA in general. So whether we can bring those production back to the United States at a big scales, it was happening step by step a little bit. It's not like at way we're going to bring all or most of our production back to the United States, so we can have a better, more sustainable supply chain or avoid those kind of we have been often talking about unethical behaviors. Workers working in the overseas factories, working overtime, but not getting overtime pay, or they are not being compensated with the benefits they are supposed to receive because there are lack of monitoring mechanism in the overseas locations. So we will, even we bring those production back to the United States, we will still have those issues probably at a smaller scales. So it was happening, particularly what's happening in California. So we bring more production back to the United States before COVID-19. And although it's not in a big portion, probably still only 2.53% made in USA, but we started seeing those insourcing movement happen, and providing job positions, providing local economic growth opportunities. But we also were seeing some limitations about skilled workers' production capacity, particularly with COVID-19 impact. So some limited production capacity has been taken by or devoted to PPE production. So insourcing is an option, but probably right now is still the minority, and the global sourcing is still the majority. And also the government passing the new US, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement. So CBI, Caribbean Basin Initiative is still there, and the CAFTA is still there. So there are many determinants affecting what we, a company, making decisions in terms of sourcing their products. So, but overall, I see a lot of more actions taken and more positive impacts is happening to make the industry overall better, more sustainable.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the presentation. And we have a couple of questions here. One of the questions is, what do you think is the reason that fabric suppliers are not willing to share their fiber supplies or yarn suppliers? Does it depend on the cost, or what might be the other reasons for that?
Okay, so probably I can just quickly share my personal observation. So definitely there could be multiple reasons out there. One is, I think currently still many sourcing is based on short-term contract. So kind of vendor and their importers, they're based on some short-term relationship. So kind of, you are kind of lack of trust. So why I have to share with my somehow like a business secret. But I think, gradually companies realize, a closer vendor-importer relationship is very, very important to kind of, stand out in a competition. And especially during COVID, putting this way, because of COVID, retailers, fashion brands, they recognize the importance of kind of treating vendor like a partner. So I think more kind of collaboration and really changed the nature of the relationship will make some positive kind of difference.
Is insourcing the same as reshoring, or are there any differences? Basically, it means made in US, but are there any subtle differences in the terms or not? Insourcing versus reshoring.
So Dr. Sheng Lu, you can add if my response is not 100% accurate. So my understanding, reshoring sometimes also refer to nearshoring. So reshoring is bring production back or close to the consumer market. One of the advantages for reshoring is a quick response and reduce unnecessary overproduction. So right now there's a big issue in terms of sustainability, is overproduction. So if like Dr. Sheng, he teaches merchandising plan. So merchandising plans in our industry, we often to do 6 months merchandising plan. So some companies doing the 9 months or 12 months. And in order to prepare enough inventory to meet the demand of the buyer or retailers or brands, so the manufacturers always overproduce, so overstock in order to avoid missing sales or the demand. So there's the oversupply issue cause a lot of unnecessary resource waste. So bring the production closer to the consumer market with the purpose we're going to reduce overproduction and respond more accurately and quickly to consumer demand. So which means nearshore sourcing is also.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kim Hiller, who is a professor at Kansas State University. Her areas of expertise include sustainability within the supply chain and consumer behavior. She's a much published author who has received funding for research seeking to understand and encourage sustainable apparel consumption. She also teaches sustainable courses at K-State for both undergraduates and graduate students. And interestingly, Kim, you taught using the Dangers of Fashion book this past fall. I hope we can hear a little bit about that. And another fun fact is that Kim sewed over 1,000 masks to help protect friends and family during COVID-19. So Kim, I give you the floor. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah, and thank you for everyone for attending tonight and being with us this evening. As I present tonight, I also about the role, the largely unrecognized role that fashion is contributing to global climate change. I would like to acknowledge that I co-authored this chapter in the book with my colleague here at K-State, Melody LaHue, and so she is also part of this presentation tonight, vicariously, I guess. So as the title of the chapter of our book suggests, in the big climate change conversations and picture that's happening right now, what we read and see in the media, what our government policies tend to focus on, what a majority of climate change scientists are researching, the fashion industry is minimally at best neglected, and more frequently it's actually completely ignored or overlooked. In conversations that I have, or just in general about industrial and human behavior causes of climate change, there is a lot of focus on things like transportation and agriculture, and so much so that when I talk to people about the significant role that the fashion industry is playing in global climate change, they're often just in genuine disbelief because they hadn't thought about it before. So in my time this evening, I want to just talk a little bit about, give a brief overview of how and why the fashion industry is such a large player in climate change, and then of course use some time to answer questions about maybe things that need to change, etc. So consider this. Every year, the fashion industry produces between 80 to 100 billion garments, and that is actually approximately 400% more clothing than was produced 20 years ago, and that number actually just continues to increase. The average North American wears a garment only 7 times before they dispose of it, and a majority of women in North America wear significantly less than 50% of the clothes in their closet. In fact, there's some informal research to suggest that we as women are actually maybe only wearing 20 to 30% of the clothes that we own. So what? Why is this bad? Why should we care? It should be great for the economy that we're producing so many clothes. Well, I would argue that it's actually this rapid production and consumption of clothing behaviors that are contributing to very significant environmental issues. There are environmental consequences to manufacturing, distributing, and consuming fashion items. And I would say, just big picture, we have water consumption issues, we have water pollution issues, we're generating a whole lot of solid waste, and of course, we are generating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm here this evening to focus on the last consequence, greenhouse gas emissions, and the resulting contributions that that's making to climate change. The reality is the global fashion industry carries an extraordinarily high energy load. It takes a lot of energy to manufacture fibers, textiles, and clothing. And this is compounded by the fact that due to the globalized nature of our industry, significant transportation occurs between and within each stage of the supply chain. Additionally, it's important to keep in mind that a large majority of our fibers, textiles, and clothes are produced in countries like China, Bangladesh, and India. And this is important because these are all countries that are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels to meet their country's energy needs. And of course, when we burn fossil fuels, we are emitting greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, and greenhouse gases are the primary driver of climate change. As a result of the sheer size of our industry and the sheer volume of clothes that we're making, as well as this heavy reliance on non-renewable energy in the countries where manufacturing is dominant, The fashion industry accounts for 10% of all global carbon emissions. It's one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters on the planet, and it's crazy that we aren't talking about this more. Although the carbon footprint is large throughout all stages of our fashion supply chain, from fiber production through to consumer use and disposal, our chapter of the book focuses on the pre-consumer manufacturing stages of the supply chain, which are the stages of fiber, yarn, fabric, and clothing manufacturing. This figure that I have on this slide is a graphic that I use in almost all of the classes that I teach at K-State to help our students understand the fashion industry system and to work with them on identifying the connections between system inputs and system outputs and the corresponding environmental consequences, including climate change. All of these manufacturing stages involve a multitude of steps and processes, and all of these processes utilize large industrial equipment in modern factories that require a lot of electricity and other forms of energy. What I like about using this figure with students is that it reminds them that system inputs results in outputs. And if we're going to change the outputs, such as reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to change the inputs. I find this to be a pretty good starting point for conversations with students about climate change and the fashion industry and fashion production, especially because for a majority of our students, this is new knowledge to them that they haven't heard about or learned about before. So a carbon footprint represents the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted by something during a given period of time. Understanding the carbon footprint of a product, so in this case, the product would be fibers, yarns, textiles, and clothing, reveals the cost of the product in terms of carbon dioxide. And it gives us, the carbon footprint gives us an idea of how our actions are affecting greenhouse gases, in the amount of greenhouse gases that's going into the atmosphere. Increasing concern for the fashion industry's environmental impacts has spurred a variety of different carbon footprint assessments from several different perspectives. So for example, there have been carbon footprint studies that have looked at the carbon footprint of different fibers, such as cotton versus polyester. There's been carbon footprinting studies that have highlighted the carbon footprint of a specific product, such as a t-shirt. And then there are other studies out there that look at the various different stages of the supply chain and how carbon footprint is different across the supply chain. So tonight I just want to briefly touch on what we know about the carbon footprint of different stages of manufacturing, as well as what we know about the differences in carbon footprinting between cotton and polyester. So first, as far as the carbon footprint of different manufacturing stages is, I have some statistics up here. There is an organization called the Business for Social Responsibility, and I have the citation up here. They have done a study looking at carbon footprinting across the supply chain. And according to this report, in general, fiber production is responsible for approximately 18% of greenhouse gas emissions across the total supply chain, from fiber all the way through disposal. And yarn manufacturing, so spinning, blending, accounts for approximately 21% of our total carbon footprint. So a significant amount of an apparel product's total carbon footprint results from those first two stages of its life cycle, the fiber production and then the yarn production. Next slide. At the stages of fiber and yarn production, the sources of carbon emissions do differ pretty dramatically between natural and synthetic fibers. As we know, natural fibers are generally agriculturally cultivated, and synthetic fibers are chemically derived from the most part fossil fuel products such as petroleum. And because cotton and polyester are the two dominant fibers in our fashion industry, I tended to, and in the book, focus on those two fibers to illustrate the differences in carbon footprints between cotton and polyester. Cotton fiber and yarn production produces greenhouse gases primarily at the agricultural stage and then the subsequent processing stages. Fossil fuels are, of course, being burned by diesel and gas-powered farm equipment, as well as through all of the electric-powered factory machinery that's used. And if the cotton happens to be dyed at the yarn stage, then there are energy demands related to dyeing, and so the carbon footprint just continues to grow. Manufacturing a synthetic fiber such as polyester carries an even higher carbon footprint. Polyester, like most synthetic fibers, starts with the creation of polymers from petrochemicals, which involves a lot of energy. To take something that was once oil and to turn it into something that is plastic, it's not going to carry a light energy load. According to that previously mentioned study by the BSR, polyester production uses actually more than double the amount of energy than it takes to produce cotton. So at the fiber stage, polyester carries a much higher carbon footprint than cotton. So it's actually estimated that on an annual basis, about 706 billion kilograms of greenhouse gases can be attributed to polyester production. That is equivalent to the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted in supplying 64 million homes in the US with electricity for 1 year. After yarn production, the carbon footprint of the remaining pre-consumer phases, such as textile production, garment production, is much less impacted by the type of fiber. For example, during fabric manufacturing, fossil fuels continue to be relied on to generate all of the electricity for machines and to heat water for wet processing. Similarly, during clothing manufacturing, all the cut and sew processes rely on electricity and energy, and those are typically generated. That electricity comes usually from the burning of fossil fuels, and so then we continue to emit more greenhouse gases. Most carbon footprint studies assert that considering the entirety of the supply chain, apparel manufacturing, so the actual garment construction, consumes the least amount of electricity out of all of the various different stages and has the smallest carbon footprint. So in conclusion, I think I would also be remiss not to remind everybody that fibers, yarns, textiles, and garments are transported between and within countries multiple times before they actually are on a display rack in a retail store. And all of that transportation also carries a very heavy carbon footprint. So the sheer number of processes that we have involved in all of these stages, coupled with the huge volume of clothes that we're actually producing annually every year, that's combined is what makes the overall footprint of the fashion industry such a significant and unfortunately overlooked concern. So that is a summary of my chapter, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Kim. I know your chapter is incredibly compelling about the dangers of fashion to the environment. We have a couple of really great questions. One of them includes, how do we encourage consumers to shop less and consume less?
Well, I think that's actually key. So a lot of people will ask me, well, what should we be doing? How can we produce fewer, how can we reduce the carbon footprint of the fashion industry? And that's like my first go-to response is we just need to buy fewer clothes. I don't actually have a good answer to how to do that yet. That's what I spend a lot of my time researching and trying to sort of make that psychological connection with people. I think that it's easier to convince younger consumers of this. I see a real shift in our college students in the last several years. They've bought in. They don't have to be convinced that climate change is an issue, and they You know, they're much more likely to buy secondhand. They're much more likely to share and swap clothes. I think it's just their generation as they're growing up. So I actually don't have a very good answer for how do we convince them to purchase less. I just know that that's what has to happen.
Yes, you know, and going in line with that, we know some companies like Patagonia and Eileen Fisher, a couple of the other companies that you've mentioned in your chapter, they've made a commitment to sustainability. That's part of their marketing, almost marketing. What about the other companies? Do you foresee them, you know, seeing that these environmental concerns are so serious and making some changes to their operation, or will they just continue to produce goods as long as there is a market for them?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. I have been reading quite a bit about the effect that COVID-19 is going to have on companies' commitment towards sustainability, and how a number of companies are actually using this moment as a reset and sort of thinking through this time where we have people who are, now that we have consumers who are kind of forced to purchase less because they can't get to the stores, how can we use that time to reset and rethink who we are and move more towards sustainability? So there is some speculation that some companies will kind of, in the next 5 years, we'll start to see that shift. I think there will always be companies out there until they until it's no longer economically profitable for them to just spew out fast fashion. Yes, they'll continue to do it. But I am hoping that, you know, like if I were to compare where we're at in these conversations now compared to 10 years ago, I've seen a massive shift already. So hopefully we'll keep shifting in that direction.
Wow, that is hopeful. Thank you so much, Kim. I'm going to turn it over to Elena for our next speaker.
Our next presenter is Dr. Pam Norum. She is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Textile Apparel Management at the University of Missouri, and her research focuses on analyzing apparel demand and consumption, and specifically sustainable apparel consumption. One of the reasons Pam started researching sustainable clothing practices was when her 20-something, at the time, daughter asked if a tailor would hem a pair of pants for her. Pam then realized how she had never taught her daughter basic sewing or mending skills, and she didn't pick them up in school. That motivated Pam's research on generational differences in clothing maintenance practices. So with that, I'm turning it to Pam.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. And thanks, Elena and Sara, for organizing this. As noted, Rachel LaMonaco-Benzine was my co-author on this chapter. And I want to put the maintenance piece in the context of the broader clothing consumption process, because according to Beetle Winokur from her seminal article in the 1960s, the clothing consumption process consists of acquisition, maintenance, and disposal. And so you have issues related to the acquisition and how much people buy. You have the maintenance piece, which is frequently overlooked, probably, compared to the other two. And then the disposal piece that really relates to textile waste. So in this presentation, I am going to talk about historical, cultural, and ethical considerations, starting with the historical. And, you know, how laundry was done in similar ways for centuries. And even in the 19th and 20th century, people were still washing by hand, using washboards and wash basins, hand crank wash machines. It was a laborious process that could include boiling water, rinsing clothes, maybe bluing and starching. In some cases, people needed to get their own water. In many cases that they were getting from a communal area, it may not have been clean and disease-ridden, for example, with typhoid. Typically, with respect to the technology, they would have hung it to dry historically. And then ironing it involved, you know, heavy irons that had to be heated up, sometimes in open fires. And so that was also a danger. In terms of social components, the cleanliness standards that people held, for example, in the United States, did start to change throughout the 20th century. And we had early home economists who worked as educators to help educate people about hygiene. And then we saw also as part of our society, the emphasis on providing education through 4-H or home ec classes in schools where, well, women, females, students in particular, learned how to sew and to mend, but they were also being taught that at home. With the second wave feminist movement in the 70s, we saw sort of a backlash against traditional home economics. At the same time, the labor force participation of women increased. And so, and this is one of the things that affected me with respect to that story about my daughter. Even though my daughter had a little sewing in school, and I asked her if she wanted to learn more at home, she actually told me no, she did not. So I had never sat down and really spent the time because I was busy and I was working. And even though I had the skills, I did not pass them on. And so sort of the millennial generation and after, research has shown that they don't have the same level of skills in terms of mending and other things related to that as, say, the baby boomers or even Gen X. And over time, public funding for traditional home economics has decreased. So there's not the opportunity there for that kind of education. In terms of economics, certainly when we talk about how can you change people's behavior, you know, much of it comes down to prices and income. And during the Depression, you saw people were resourceful out of necessity. They might take men's suit and convert it into children's clothing or women's clothing. People were making crazy quilts. People were not buying excessive amounts of clothing. And so in some cases, it's all a matter of sort of the economics. And if standard of livings are high and the prices are low, you'll still see that demand there and businesses will fulfill it. And with the labor force participation of women, what we saw was an increase in the value of their time. And so they started shifting to buying services in the marketplace, such as repair, rather than doing it at home. Culturally, this just gives you a little idea of all the variations that exist throughout the world in terms of how clothing, in particular here, laundry can be done. So in Germany, it's common for households to have horizontal access washers. They're front-loading wash machines that help decrease water use and the amount of energy used. In Brazil, they have semi-automatic washing machines that agitate the clothes to such an extent that the suds can actually be used for a second load, but the clothes have to be rinsed by hand. In the Philippines, they wash clothes using communal water, wash them by hand. In India, there's the Dobie Caste that provides laundry services for people in facilities where the clothes are washed by hand, beaten on a hard surface, and then hung to dry. And actually, their livelihood could be threatened as the standard of living in India increases and more consumers buy consumer goods like wash machines. In terms of ethical considerations, there is the issue, and this also ties in with environmental, like how much water is appropriate for us to be using. And certainly in washing, there's a lot of water that does get used. But there's also the problem with not everybody in the world has access to clean water, or even in the United States, when you consider places like Flint, Michigan. In terms of energy use, the more laundry people are doing, the more energy they use, and especially with drying, it uses a lot of energy. And then there's the access, like what's the opportunity for people to even take care of their clothing? And one of the things that water comes into play, but also, for example, many people don't own their own wash machine or or drier. I mean, a large percent of the United States consumers do, but not everybody. And one of the things that's happened since 2005 is that in many cities, the number of laundromats has declined. So there's not even the opportunity for people to wash their clothes easily when they would like to.
Thank you so much, Pam. I really appreciated your comments. You know, learning the skills, right? Learning the skills of sewing and mending and so many other skills that we seem to be losing with education in the school system. We had a question about the industry and consumption. How will it change in the post-pandemic world? I know Kim talks about that a little bit. I'm wondering if you had an idea about that.
Well, I do think that because of COVID, it's had a severe economic impact. And I'm not certain that we're done seeing the impact of that. And just as in the Depression, when there was a severe economic impact, that if people don't have the income, they will not buy as many clothes. That will not be their first priority. The second piece is that because of COVID, there's this shift to working at home. So many people, you hear about people just getting up and going to their Zoom meetings in their pajamas. There's a need to have less variety for clothes when you're staying at home and not going out to work. So people will then kind of naturally, because of those reasons, buy less clothing. And that will have implications, I think, for manufacturers and retailers. I also think that it has implications not in terms of the quantity, but that people have become used to ordering clothes online. And so an online presence, and just whether it's food or clothes or whatever, people are going to be more accustomed to using the internet for purchases. And that will have, I think, implications for stores and malls that affect our field.
Are there certain clothing pieces or products that consumers typically overwash?
I haven't seen any research on that. I would say that consumers probably overwash, in a sense, probably almost anything that could be washed, because I think what the tendency is for many people would be to come home, like say from work or wherever they've been, not from working out, but you come home at the end of the day and you throw things in the laundry, or it's just easier to throw things on a chair, and then at the end of the week you pick them all up and you put them in your laundry basket rather than going in and consciously hanging that up. So people, I think, then end up doing more laundry than they need to be probably doing. They could wear garments more often, like multiple times, come home and put on the same shirt 3 nights in a row because it's probably not really dirty, or 2 days in a row of wearing the same clothes and not doing laundry as often. I also think that people overdo laundry in terms of using too much soap. And I also think that there's over laundering in a sense in terms of using warmer temperatures than they need to. And so that I think most clothes, even though some people might disagree with me, could be done in cold water. And I've only used cold water for a number of since years now. It would be unusual for me to do something on warm water. So there's a variety of different ways we might be overdoing things. And I also think you can do some natural things like the balls, like whether it's out of wool or whatever, to help absorb some of that moisture and reduce the drying time, or if possible, may not be clotheslines, but drying racks would be another option to reduce the over laundering of clothing.
If as consumers we actually do consume less, will there be an increased focus on quality? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think that it depends on, every company out there is producing for a specific target market. And if you think about the masses, and in the United States, the poor get poorer and the rich get richer according to the income statistics. And when you increase the quality, you got to increase the price. And so, like, who's going to buy it, the higher quality at higher prices? Yes, people who can shop at Patagonia or Eileen Fisher. But the people buying their clothes at Walmart, I don't know. Is Walmart going to start? They're mass producing for millions of U.S. consumers. Are they going to start increasing their quality? I don't know about that because that's not what their market is, but I'll see what others have to say.
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree with what Pam said. The companies that are sort of forward thinking in the sustainability world, they're definitely focusing on quality. They're also focusing on maintaining clothes, repairing clothes. I mean, Patagonia does amazing things with teaching people how to mend their clothes and embracing the mend, like making it part of the story so that you sort of form that emotional bond to your clothes. But again, there's not everybody can afford those higher quality clothes. And so perhaps if companies that their niche market is producing for lower, like moderate or budget price points, they need to be focusing on other strategies for increasing the sustainability of their production without you know, raising the price point of their clothing drastically. I should also say that you know, a lot of what my concerns with climate change would be solved if our governments would just get on board and stop using fossil fuels and being reliant on fossil fuels for energy production. So much of what we're concerned with in the fashion industry is because we are burning coal to make our electricity. And if we switched to renewable resources, we wouldn't have to have these conversations in the same way.
If there's going to be big structural changes, some of it could also not just be economic, but come from government shifting what they incentivize, and that would help get businesses in line.
Yeah, just with one very quick point to add. You know, my area is trade and sourcing, and I want to really say, you know, trade agreements these days is not just about, you know, offering preferential duty. If you look at USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, for the first time they add new regulations about environmental protection, about labor standards. I think, you know, these kind of new movements will definitely also make a change, a positive change in the industry.
Yeah, I also want to just add one more point. So we're talking about overproduction, we're talking about oversupply, we're talking about overconsumption. So that's those are all critical issues. We need to think about the solutions, but also there is a critical issue facing this industry or consumers as a whole or government agencies is recycling. So we are consuming so many garments, and only 15% of the used clothing right now are being recycled. So 85% of textiles and clothing end up with landfills or incineration. So it's a huge waste of the precious resources, particularly for the cotton, instead of producing the virgin new cotton. So we can, if we're able to find a way, the infrastructure to bring those used clothing back and do the recycling or upcycling and use those materials to produce garments, we can eliminate largely to use the new materials to produce brand new clothing. So whether it's lack of coordination or the certain infrastructure supporting this upcycling, recycling process, it will have profound big impact on this industry.
Well, thank you all. I think there is hope for us as consumers, as an industry, as educators.
Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Wetzbarger, and I'm the coordinator for the Conversations on Dress. I am going to use this 2 seconds to speak to what some of the panelists have said. I work in the resale sector, and as Sheng just mentioned, only 15% of the garments in the economy are reused. So I think if we can, you know, reduce and reuse by buying more higher quality garments and following the programs such as Eileen Fisher and Patagonia to keep them in the in the life cycle longer, we can make a big impact. I would encourage everyone in this meeting to go back and look at our pre-recorded session on our YouTube channel on Mend and how to extend the life cycle of your garments, whether they be fast fashion or luxury. And I really thank all the participants of this panel and the subsequent and future panels, because they give such insight into what a responsibility we have being within the fashion sector to create a more sustainable and realistic future. The United States lowered our carbon emissions by 10% this year due to the pandemic. Like, that's not sustainable, but maybe through a chosen consciousness, we can continue to do that. So with that, I will sign off and lend it off to Sara and Elena to close it off. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you all. Graham, thank you so much for your organization of this. It's been wonderful. Have a wonderful night, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.